All right, so let's dive into this situation in Gaza. We've got sources here from Al Jazeera, the Israeli military, and AFP, and they're all painting a pretty devastating picture of this airstrike on a displacement camp. But the thing that really kind of jumps out at me is this camp, Al-Mawasi. It was supposed to be a safe zone, right? People were told to evacuate there for their own protection.
Yeah, it's one of those situations that immediately raises questions. You've got the civil defense reporting 20 people killed, including 5 children. And some of the eyewitness accounts that we're seeing in Al Jazeera, they're using the word incinerated to describe what happened. But at the same time, you have the Israeli military saying, no. We were targeting senior Hamas terrorists. They even go so far as to claim there were these secondary explosions, suggesting that weapons were being stored there.
Okay, so we've got these two very different narratives. But even if we take the Israeli military statement at face value, targeting terrorists in a designated safe zone where civilians are sheltering, including children, I mean, doesn't that raise some serious red flags?
Yeah, it does. It definitely complicates the issue. And it's really crucial to remember that we don't have independent verification of either side of the story. Figuring out the truth in these kinds of situations, it's incredibly challenging. But this term, secondary explosions, it's one that we hear a lot in this conflict. And it's definitely worth exploring a little further.
Right, it seems like every time there's an airstrike, we hear about secondary explosions. So what does that actually mean, and why is it always such a point of contention?
Well, the way the Israeli military often uses it is to suggest that the location they targeted, that it was storing weapons or explosives. The idea is that the initial strike sets off these additional explosions, and that indicates a bigger cache of weaponry than they might have initially seen.
So basically, they're using it to justify striking a place, even if civilians are there. But are these secondary explosions always a sure sign of weapons storage?
Well, not necessarily. It can be really complex to try to figure out what caused secondary explosions. Sometimes it is legitimate evidence that they were storing weapons there, but sometimes it could be something as simple as a gas line rupturing or flammable materials that were being stored nearby. Without an independent investigation, it's really impossible to say for sure.
And of course, getting an independent investigation in an active conflict zone like that, well, that's not always possible. But this isn't the first time that Al-Mawasi has been hit, is it? Our sources mention previous attacks on this so-called safe zone.
Yeah, sadly, that's right. Back in September, there was an attack that killed 19 people. And then in July, there was another attack on Al-Mawasi, and that one resulted in 92 deaths. Both of those incidents drew international condemnation. But as we're seeing, condemnation doesn't seem to be enough to stop further attacks.
It's incredibly disheartening. I mean, think about it. Early on in this war, Gazans were ordered to evacuate to Al-Mawasi specifically because it was declared a safe zone. Tens of thousands of people went there looking for refuge. And now they've been hit 3 times. It really makes you question the whole idea of a safe zone in a situation like this.
It definitely does. It shows just how fragile it is trying to create safe spaces in the middle of a war zone. And I think this is a good point for us to kind of zoom out a little and look at the bigger picture of this conflict. The current war, it was sparked by the Hamas attacks back in October of 2023.
Right, the attacks that killed over 1,000 people in Israel, mostly civilians.
Exactly. And then in retaliation, Israel launched this huge offensive into Gaza. And the death toll has been absolutely devastating on both sides. AFP, citing official figures, reports that 12,208 people have been killed in Israel, the vast majority of them civilians. And then in Gaza, the Hamas-run health ministry, which the UN considers a reliable source, reports at least 44,532 deaths. Again, mostly civilians.
Those numbers are just, they're staggering. It's hard to even grasp the sheer scale of loss in this conflict. The human cost. We're talking about tens of thousands of lives lost. And then there's this little detail that Al Jazeera mentions about a charity pitch-in in Khan Yunis that's trying to distribute food in the middle of all this devastation. It really brings it home, that beyond the numbers, there are real people who are just struggling to survive every day.
Absolutely. And that struggle is made even harder by how many people have been displaced. Our sources indicate that pretty much the entire population of Gaza has been displaced at some point during these 14 months of war. We're talking about almost 2 million people forced from their homes. It's hard to overstate the impact that that kind of upheaval has on an entire society.
It's almost unimaginable, right? An entire population displaced. It makes you wonder what happens next. Where do these people go? What does the future hold for Gaza?
Well, those are the questions that really linger, and I think it's so important for us to remember that the effects of this conflict, they reach far beyond the immediate casualties. We're talking about the potential for long-term economic devastation, the psychological trauma that's been inflicted on an entire generation, the very real risk of further radicalization. These are wounds that can take decades to heal.
And it's not just Gaza that carries these scars. The impact on Israel is profound as well. The constant fear of attacks, the deep political divisions, and the moral questions that come up from things like these repeated strikes on a designated safe zone.
You're absolutely right. The trauma, the moral wrestling, it's not limited to just one side. It affects every aspect of life on both sides. It impacts the entire region, and it shapes how the whole world sees this conflict. It's a stark reminder that there are no clean wars, especially in a place as densely populated as Gaza.
And it forces us to ask ourselves some really uncomfortable questions. Like, in a conflict this devastating, with such a horrific human cost on both sides, can anyone really claim victory? What does a just resolution even look like?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there are any easy answers. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean that we can shy away from asking those questions. I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the victims on both sides, and we owe it to the future to really grapple with these questions.
Absolutely. And there's another piece of this that we need to talk about, the role of the international community. Our sources mention international condemnation after the previous attacks on al-Mawasi, but condemnation without action, those are just empty words.
Yeah, I think it's important to go beyond just pointing fingers and start asking what concrete actions the international community can take to prevent more bloodshed and work towards a lasting peace. What tools do they have? Sanctions, diplomacy, military intervention.
And each of those options comes with its own set of potential consequences, right? It's a very delicate balancing act. But who gets to make those decisions? Is it the UN, individual countries? And can we ever really find a solution that works for everyone, or at least minimizes the harm?
It's a tangled web for sure. But I think the important thing is to start somewhere, to acknowledge that it's complex without letting that complexity paralyze us.
You know, as we're talking about all of this, I keep thinking about that detail from Al Jazeera about the charity kitchen in Khan Yunis. It's such a powerful contrast, this incredible resilience and determination to help others in the face of such overwhelming devastation.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can still shine through. But it's also call to action. We can't mistake endurance for acceptance. We can't let ourselves become numb to this level of suffering. We can't just let it become the status quo.
So what can we do? I mean, we're just two people having a conversation here. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think that's where you, the listener, come in. We've laid out the facts, the different narratives, the moral dilemmas. We've looked at how complex this conflict is and how challenging it is to find a way forward. Now it's your turn to take what you've learned and engage with the world around you.
Have those difficult conversations with your friends, your family, your colleagues. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Challenge your own assumptions. Seek out different perspectives. It can feel overwhelming, I know. I mean, how can our individual actions really make a difference in a conflict as complex and entrenched as this one?
It's a question we all struggle with. But I think the key is understanding that lasting change, it rarely comes from big, sweeping gestures. It starts with each of us taking responsibility to become informed, to engage in thoughtful dialogue, and to demand better from our leaders and from ourselves.
So rather than getting bogged down by how big the problem is, we should focus on those small individual steps that we can take, like educating ourselves, having those uncomfortable conversations, challenging our own preconceived notions.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing the humanity of everyone involved. It's easy to fall into that trap of us versus them thinking, but it's so important to remember that behind every statistic, behind every headline, there are real people whose lives have been forever changed by this conflict.
You know, it's interesting. We've spent a lot of time today talking about the devastation, the political complexities, the challenges that seem almost impossible to overcome. But my mind keeps going back to that image of the charity kitchen in Khan Yunis. It's a reminder that even in the midst of so much darkness, there's this incredible resilience, this determination to help others.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating to me is that these acts of kindness, of compassion, they're happening on both sides of this conflict. We hear about Israeli doctors treating wounded Palestinians, Palestinian families giving shelter to displaced Israelis. These stories don't always make it into the news, but they show the enduring power of human connection, even when people are facing unimaginable adversity.
Those stories give me hope, because if those individuals can find a way to see past the hatred and the fear, to reach out with compassion, then surely the rest of us can too.
I think that's a really powerful message to leave our listeners with.
Yeah.
We can't allow ourselves to become desensitized to the suffering, to the injustice. We have to resist the urge to turn away, to give in to despair. Instead, we need to channel that energy into action, into demanding a more just and peaceful future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. What does a just resolution look like to you? What role do you feel called to play in working towards that vision? It's not going to be easy. There are no quick fixes. But the more informed and engaged we are, the better chance we have of creating a world where a conflict like this, with such a devastating cost, never happens again. It's almost unimaginable, isn't it? An entire population displaced. It makes you wonder, what happens next? Where do all these people go? What does the future even hold for Gaza?
Yeah, these are the questions that really stick with you. And I think it's important to recognize that the impact of this conflict, it goes way beyond just the immediate casualties,
Yeah.
We're talking about the possibility of long-term economic damage, the psychological trauma that a whole generation is going through. And then there's the very real risk that all of this will lead to more radicalization. These are wounds that could take decades to heal.
And it's not just Gaza that has to deal with all of that. The impact on Israel is huge, too.
Absolutely.
With constant fear of being attacked, the deep political divides, and all the moral questions that come up from things like those repeated strikes on a safe zone.
You're right. The trauma, the moral struggles, they aren't limited to just one side of this. It affects everything from both sides. It impacts the entire region.
Yeah.
And it shapes how the rest of the world sees this conflict. It's a really stark reminder that there's no such thing as a clean war, especially not in a place that's as densely populated as Gaza.
And it forces us to ask ourselves some really uncomfortable questions. Like, in a conflict that's this destructive, with such a terrible cost in terms of human life on both sides, can anyone really say they won? What would a just resolution even look like?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there are any easy answers. But the fact that it's hard doesn't mean we can just avoid it. We have to face these questions, I think. We owe it to ourselves, to the victims on both sides, and to the future.
I completely agree. And there's another layer to this that we have to talk about, the role of the international community. Our sources mention international condemnation after the earlier attacks on al-Mawasi, but condemning something without taking action, it just feels like empty words.
Yeah, I think we need to move past just pointing fingers and ask ourselves, what can the international community actually do to actually prevent more bloodshed and actually work towards a lasting peace? What options are there? Sanctions? Diplomacy? Should they intervene militarily?
Right, and each of those options has its own potential consequences. It's a delicate balance. So who gets to decide? Is it the UN, individual countries? And can we ever really find a solution that satisfies everyone? Or at least minimizes the harm as much as possible?
It's a messy situation, that's for sure. But the important thing is to start somewhere, to try to do something, to recognize that it's complicated, but not let that stop us from trying to find a solution.
You know, as we're talking about this, I can't stop thinking about that detail from Al Jazeera about that charity kitchen in Khan Yunis.
Yeah.
It's such a stark contrast, this amazing resilience, this determination to help other people, even though they're facing this overwhelming devastation.
It's a powerful reminder that even when things are at their worst, people can still find a way to be kind to each other. But it's also a reminder that we need to do something. We can't just accept that this is how things are. We can't become numb to this level of suffering. We can't let this become the new normal.
So what can we do? We're just two people having a conversation, I mean. But where do we go from here?
I think that's where you, the listener, come in. We've talked about the facts, the conflicting stories, the ethical questions. We've looked at how complicated this conflict is and how hard it is to find a way forward. Now it's your turn. Take what you've learned and try to make a difference in the world around you.
Have those tough conversations with your friends and family, with your co-workers. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Question your own assumptions. Try to understand different points of view. Yeah, it can feel overwhelming, for sure. It makes you wonder, can our actions really make a difference? Especially in something as complicated and messy as this.
Yeah, it's something we all think about, I think. But I really believe that big changes, lasting changes, they usually don't come from these huge, dramatic events. They start with individuals. It starts with all of us taking responsibility to learn about the situation, to really talk about it and think about it, and to demand better from the people in charge, from our leaders, and from ourselves, too, I think.
So instead of getting stuck on how big the problem is, we should focus on the small things we can do individually, like educating ourselves, having those uncomfortable conversations, and challenging the ideas we already have.
Exactly. And remembering that everyone involved is a human being.
Right.
We can get caught up in that us versus them mentality. But it's crucial to remember that behind all the numbers and headlines, there are real people whose lives have been completely changed by this.
You know, it's funny. We've spent a lot of time talking about the terrible things that have happened, the political complications, all the challenges that seem impossible to solve. But I keep coming back to that image of the charity kitchen in Khan Yunis. It shows you that even in the worst situations, people are incredibly resilient. They still want to help each other.
It is amazing, isn't it? And you know what's really interesting to me? These acts of kindness, this compassion, they're happening on both sides of this conflict. You hear about Israeli doctors treating Palestinians who have been hurt, and Palestinian families who are sheltering Israelis who have lost their homes. You don't always hear these stories, but they show you that even in the middle of terrible things, people can still connect with each other.
Those stories definitely give me hope, because if those people can find a way to look past all the hate and the fear and show compassion, then we can too.
I think that's a really powerful message for our listeners. Don't let yourselves become numb to what's happening, to the suffering, to the injustice. Don't turn away. Don't give in to despair. Instead, use that energy to do something, to make a difference, demand a better future, a more peaceful future, a more just future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this question. What does a just solution to this look like for you? And what role do you feel like you need to play to make that happen? It won't be easy, that's for sure. There are no quick or simple answers. But I truly believe that the more informed and engaged we are, the better chance we have of building a world where this kind of conflict, with this level of devastation, never happens again.